Round two.
All right, Chai, welcome back to the show. Glad to have you here.
Hey, thanks. It's a fantastic honor to be here, and it's a lot of fun.
So we just recently started getting into what you had experienced while you were in the U.S. Air Force, strange lights in the sky, things like that. Where does it go from there?
All right, let's see. 2 UFO sightings, high altitude, Blytheville Air Force Base, and then Davis-Monthan. Well, during my career, just like you and I are having these conversations, when you get to know people and you get to talking and they trust you enough to share some, some accounts or experiences that they've had, and they sort of get a feeling from me that I wouldn't ridicule them, that I just hear them out, and they have no reason to lie. They're professionals. They have a lot to lose, including clearances. If word gets out, hey man, Jim over there, he said he saw Bigfoot in his backyard. Not that anyone ever told me that, but if word got out to your bosses and supervisors, they might question your competence, and that's a big deal because you don't want to lose your clearance. So over the years of my military experience and as a defense contractor in the intelligence community and out of the intelligence community, people would share with me some of the strange things that they had experienced. And, like I had shared previously, I'd seen 2 different UFO sightings. Nothing up close and personal, just lights in the sky that did strange things that conventional aircraft could not do. And so, I was at Minot Air Force Base, and we had nuclear weapons there in the form of ICBMs, intercontinental ballistic missiles, that were spaced out around the base in a rough horseshoe pattern, many, many miles away surrounding the base. There were 15 launch control facilities, and each launch control facility had about 10 ICBMs at the time. And this is like many years ago. And so there are quite a few nukes buried in the ground in North Dakota around the base. Now on the base, it also was a strategic air command base that had on alert many B-52 Stratofortress bombers that were loaded up with armed nuclear warheads, ready to take off and attack our enemy should nuclear war happen. So it was very important for security of these nuclear weapons on these bombers. And so every few years or so, the base would undergo a nuclear surety inspection. And a base commander, if he fails this, that's his career, because these are nukes. So you cannot fail a nuclear surety inspection. So they got together all the personnel they could to help augment the security forces personnel. They were shorthanded. So they came and trained everybody else up on how to shoot a grenade launcher. They briefed everybody up on how to do your AR-15, and they trained you to become a security forces specialist, regardless of what your career field was. So they needed help with their nuclear surety exercise, and I'm out there with the security forces personnel, and everybody gets to talking because you're at guard mount together, you're getting armed together, you're getting your ammo, you're eating chow together, and you're standing a post together. And they started talking about some of the weird things that happened at Minot. And one of the stories, a couple of stories that got me, involved cryptozoological creatures. And apparently one night, middle of winter, very cold, security forces are on alert. They're told by their immediate supervisor, their sergeant, that the flight sergeant who oversees all of the different areas, he is going to test the security personnel. He will attempt to breach their perimeter. And if this happens, if the flight sergeant can sneak past your position, you get into big trouble. At least a letter of reprimand, maybe an Article 15, which is non-judicial punishment. I mean, it's a serious violation of what your duty is, because these are live nukes. That means if he can sneak by you, so can a terrorist. Well, these 2 guys are at a remote guard post with a guard shack out there on a far end of the flight line. It's nighttime. And again, the sergeant calls up and says, hey, look, the flight sergeant is going to try to break the perimeter. Keep your eyes open. Stay frosty. Yes, sir. And after a while, they see what seems to be the flight sergeant crawling around in the high grass about maybe 50 to 70 yards away from them, under the moonlight inside the perimeter fence, the barbed wire full-size perimeter fence. And they call up the sergeant saying, hey, look, we think the flight sergeant's in our sector because he's crawling around. I don't know why he's doing this, but he's crawling around the grass. We can see him, but it doesn't make any sense. And their sergeant says, nope, can't be him because he was in this other sector like 5 minutes ago, and there's no way he could have gotten to you so quickly. And so,
Wow.
yeah, so they get their spotlight out and they shine it on this figure, and it's not the flight sergeant. It stands up, faces them. It has large, glowing orange eyes. It has a big mouth. It opens its mouth filled with teeth, and it gives them this hiss, snarl hiss. It's covered in hair, and they're freaking out at the time. They're stunned. It turns around, runs away from them towards the perimeter fence, jumps over the fence, clears it, runs off into the North Dakota winter night.
Oh my gosh.
Needless to say, these airmen were freaked out, and ever since then, anytime they were put on the end of any perimeter on the far side of the base, they didn't like it.
Was there any further description as to what that was, or what is that basically it?
That's it. Its arms were a little longer than like the proportions of a human, a standard person. The glowing red eyes. It was under silver moonlight, so it wasn't like moonlight reflection because of the amber orange glow. Covered in hair, its open mouth. They saw the teeth shining in the spotlight. But there was another incident, and it involved another portable guard shack on the perimeter of the base. An airman was in there by himself. He felt a thud on the top of the guard shack. He didn't know what it was. He heard some clawing. He reached for his weapon, got it out, and he was trying to look and see what it was. Nighttime again, scratching on the metal top of the shack. He's like freaking out. He screams, and there's the shack shutters, and then it goes silent. It's quiet. And he finally, calls in for backup. They come in there. He's staying in the shack. He's not getting out. Backup arrives to the shack. And they're like, dude, hey, look at what's going on here. He's pointing to the top of the shack. He's inside. His hand, he's pointing with his index finger. It's shaking. And so the other two guys who responded, they, climb up and they look up to the top of the shack, and it has been clawed. The metal on the top of the shack has been clawed by something. They don't know what, but there's physical evidence. Something was clawing at the top of his shack.
Wow.
Yeah. And that was it for that one. So these things are happening to military personnel, but you're not going to hear them because they're afraid of being ridiculed or losing their clearance. But as they get older and they retire, more and more is coming out. But I happen to gather this.
We've definitely seen that with Roswell and different UFO sightings over the years. But now it seems like there's a lot of this sort of thing coming out about Sasquatch as well, with nuclear bases, where these things seem to just like not be afraid of the cameras. They'll come up and they'll show themselves.
Yes. And I have to say, these two incidents that I talked about at Minot were before the advent of, or I should say proliferation of security cameras. Of course we had them, and they were at key locations, but not on a distant perimeter guard shack. And so, yeah, there were no cameras there at the time. But nowadays it would be a lot different because you'd probably have your own cell phone out there, which has a camera on it,
Yeah, and it does take a while for these things to become like, oh my gosh, that's spooky, I'm not going to talk about it, to like, oh, this is a fairly normal occurrence and now I can talk about it. So I'm glad these things are coming out finally, but how much of these things that we've never heard about is astonishing.
It is. And let's see. That was at Minot. And like I said, I transitioned because of my clearance, I got the assignment at the Joint Intelligence Center Pacific at Pearl Harbor, Hawaii. So I'm in the Air Force, living on Hickam Air Force Base, but I'm technically working at Pearl Harbor at JICPAC. And that's right there. You've got Kamehameha Highway, and we're on one side of the highway, and on the other side is Pearl Harbor, and carriers and ships are pulling up right there, like 100 yards away, 200 yards away. And I had night shift. We were publishing the Daily Intelligence Bulletin. And one night I got off a little early. It was about 2:30 or 3 in the morning, and I thought, wow, I can actually go home, watch some TV, and then hit the hay and have a good day. So I'm bicycling along Kamehameha Highway to get home, and it's beautiful. You can smell the floral scents of Hawaii. I mean, you're actually smelling really fragrant tropical flowers. It was amazing. There's an island breeze, and I'm just having a good time, happy that I'm going home. I'm bicycling up the hill. Approaching me in the opposite direction, coming down the hill, is a kid on a bicycle. And I can't remember if it was a modern at the time bicycle or a vintage bicycle, but he was a Caucasian boy looking like he was 9 to 10 years old, coming down the hill on my left as I'm going up the hill on his right, or on my right. And I'm thinking, man, what is this kid doing out at 2:30 or 3 in the morning? And I'm thinking, my mind goes immediately, oh, it's a domestic dispute. Did he run away from home? I don't want to get involved with an investigation, spend the next 5 hours testifying or giving a statement. So I continue biking. And then, my good sense catches up with me, and I'm like, all right, let me just check and see if he's okay. He did not look distressed. So I turn around and I look down the hill from where I just biked up. Nothing was there. No noise, nothing.
No kid.
No kid. No bike, nothing. I linger for a minute or two. Nothing. And I just thought, wow, I mean, he looked solid. He wasn't see-through. I don't remember any distinctive noises or bells on his bike or anything like that. Yeah, just a Caucasian kid, about 9 or 10, maybe 11 years old, coming down the hill, looked solid, but then gone. So the other incident in Hawaii, completely different date and time, but I got off work again in the wee hours of the morning. I this time successfully bicycle home without seeing a potential ghost. And I did this all the time with nothing happening. But I get back to my dorm room on Hickam Air Force Base. It was Kings Hall. So I relax, watch a little TV, and it's time to go to bed. And I turn off the VCR so the TV's still on, and it becomes staticky because the VCR is off. And I use the remote to turn the TV off, and it won't work. The TV's not turning off. And most people, well, at least me, I'll fiddle with the remote for a few minutes instead of just getting off and pressing the button. And I'm fiddling with it, and it's not working. And so I'm like, man, come on. So I get up and cross the room, and I'm pressing the button on the TV, and it won't turn off, and the static is still there. And so I thought, okay. I go around behind the TV stand, and I unplug everything. There's only 2 plugs. So I unplug the VCR and the TV. Head back to the bed. The TV is still on. The static is still going. And I'm like, wait a minute. I make sure I'm awake. I'm not hallucinating. Tap myself. Go look behind the TV stand. And sure enough, nothing is plugged in. TV's not plugged in. And I go back and I look at the TV and I press the off button and it won't turn off. And I just think, all right, you win. I go lie down, put a pillow over my head, wake up the next day, plug everything in, never happened again.
That is incredibly odd.
Yeah, I mean, these aren't over the top things, but they're enough to make me wonder, like, are different dimensions intersecting? Who knows what could have caused these?
Yeah, you're right. It's not over the top, but that's not physically possible.
That's right, yeah. And some people might say, well, it could have been a residual charge. That shouldn't last more than a couple seconds.
Yeah, about 10 seconds at the most.
Yeah.
Very strange.
So it's been an interesting span in the Air Force and hearing different people's accounts. And there's so many more that I could tell too. It would take up another show. Now here's one that you haven't heard. Back to Minot, I was in visual information, and when I finally got to work in the section and finally got my cross training approved and all that stuff, the VI building, visual information, was in it. It was a regular office type building layout, but the big chunk of the building was 3 stories high. So I was surprised when I went into that part of the building that it was only a 1-story building with a drop ceiling that was 1 story with no stairs going up to any other stories. And so they told me, they said, yeah, this used to be the old B-52 flight simulator building, and the 3-story part is where they had all the machinery and equipment to house this B-52 simulator, where the pilots would get in and the hydraulics would move the cockpit of an actual B-52, up, down, left, and right to adjust with their maneuvering. And I guess over time, they had some more sophisticated equipment and they relocated the B-52 simulator to another building, or they built a new facility. I don't know what happened, but it wasn't in the visual information building because they gave it to the communication squadron saying, hey, you guys use this for VI and you can do your video lab, photo lab, and graphics department in here. And so that's why the drop ceiling came down to the first story. So naturally, you've got a lot of empty space over the area that I worked in. And you'd hear creaks and stuff because, up in North Dakota, it gets pretty windy. It's like on the extreme perimeter of Tornado Alley. In fact, one year, 3 tornadoes were on our base at the far end of the flight line. And so while everybody else is running away and taking shelter, and the security police are going through the base on loudspeakers saying, take shelter immediately, what do us visual information people do? We grab video cameras and run so we can get a good shot. So another detail that we had to perform as visual information, and we all had a pager. This is before cell phones. We all had a pager, and they would call us during extreme bad weather. And so what that meant was, like, at 2 a.m., if a blizzard was hitting the base, we used to have a base channel that would say, hey, alert, driving conditions red, black, don't drive. And we would have to go during bad conditions. One of us would have to drive through all this stuff, get to our building, update the system, and then input it so that everybody who tuned into the channel, the cable channel on base, would see the latest weather report saying, roads are closed, don't travel. Because up there, that can be life or death. So, yeah, we were the ones who had to drive through all that mess to get there. So you get the notification on your pager, hey, look, bad weather coming in, road conditions red or whatever. And so you would get out there as soon as you could to avoid the worst of the weather, go to the building by yourself at all times of the night. And you'd only get paged after it was closed. So you were alone. And you'd have to go to the heart of the building, hearing all the creaks and noises and stuff, and input the information and send it to the server, and everybody else would get the information. So it was a little spooky because you were by yourself in the middle of the night, isolated, dead of winter, might be negative 20 degrees outside. So we always found it spooky, but we didn't really know why. And, there was nothing blatant that ever happened. So a few years later, I'm still at Minot, and I hear about this book that this retired major has written. And he was a B-52 pilot, and he had been stationed at Minot and, of course, several other bases. His book was called Scare Force. It's out of print now, and I've got a copy. It's a paperback book, maybe about 100 pages long, 120. His very interesting book was about people in the Air Force who had encountered paranormal experiences of different kinds at different locations.
Interesting.
He had 2 or 3 stories that happened on Minot. One was about a haunted daycare. The other was about something else I don't remember. This came out in the 90s, late 90s. Scare Force, though. You can find it. And it's a really entertaining, easy read book. I think I ordered an additional copy from Amazon. But he was a retired major, B-52 pilot, so very credible. But one of his stories, this is what got me, was about the haunted B-52 simulator building. And that was the building I worked in, the old building. And essentially what had happened was, back during the Vietnam War, the North Vietnamese were shooting down our jets, the Phantom jets, the Thunder Chiefs, B-52 Stratofortresses, Intruders. Our planes were getting shot down by SAM missiles, surface-to-air missiles by the North. And they shot down a B-52, and it crash landed in friendly territory. Well, the bomber was scuttled. It wasn't worth saving. But they thought, hey, the nose cone area came in intact. So they chopped off the nose cone where the pilot and the crew sits, and they shipped that back to the United States. And they used that as the B-52 simulator chassis. So in that area that I told you where the hydraulics would move as the pilots who were in training would pilot this deal, and they'd have a screen in front of them showing them, what the sky looked like and all this stuff. That was the recovered B-52 nose cone of that bomber. Well, the thing is, the spooky part is the entire crew had died in that crash. So in his book, Scare Force, this major writes about how people would come in there, the maintenance crew and the bomber crew, strange things would happen, unexplained things would happen in that simulator building. And maybe that's why they relocated it to another building and just gave it to us, you know.
It could be, yeah.
So I thought that was really interesting, where I was actually in the building working there for years, at least 2 or 3, maybe 4 years, um, about 2 or 3 years, where they had that haunted B-52 simulator.
Oh, that's incredible.
Yeah, I thought that was really a little spooky now that I think about it. All those times I was there alone, you know, by myself. And at some point, you know, there was a B-52 nose cone where those pilots or the entire crew had died in the crash.
Now, Chad, we've been talking a bit about your experiences in the Air Force. However, you've also had a few experiences working as a news anchor for the LNN, I guess, network. Is it a network?
Yes, lnnusa.com. And actually, the first experience that I had, and thanks for reminding me, was when I was a reporter for the Hopewell News here in Virginia. I eventually became an editor. And someone had sent us a ghost picture. And this ghost picture, or they said it was intriguing because, you know, you can interpret the picture how you will. Is it a shadow? Is it light and shadow? Is it a reflection? Or is there something really there? So being one of the layout editors at the time, I put it in the paper and I said, hey, what do you think this is? And I wrote what the person who sent it in said it looked like. And I said, make your own judgment and let us know. And then later I put in an ad in our paper saying, hey, anyone out there, if you have a ghost photo or something interesting, send it to us. I'll publish it and we'll ask people what they think it is. And I think it'll be a lot of fun. And so I was contacted by a local paranormal investigative group called Tri-City Paranormal. And they said, hey, look, we got something better than a photo. We're going to be investigating for paranormal activity because we've heard stories. Violet Bank in Colonial Heights, Virginia. It was General Lee's Civil War headquarters during the siege of Petersburg. And I said, hey, that's great. Thank you. So I go out there for the investigation. The curator of the museum of Violet Bank is out there. And it's violet, not violent, like the color. So the curator's out there, the team's out there. I get to meet them. They're, you know, I document them setting up the 4 cameras. One of them is infrared. And they have some magnetic field detectors, the EMF detectors. They're bringing in some recorders for capturing electronic voice phenomenon. And I've got all the interviews done, all the photos taken. I'm about to leave. It's 2 something in the morning. Funny how these things always happen around the wee hours of the night.
You got to wait for the witching hour.
That's right. So I'm about to leave and I'm saying goodbye. And I'm looking at the screen. Now, no one's in the museum. The doors are shut. The curator's with us. Everyone is accounted for and outside. I'm looking at the screen as I'm saying goodbye, and the screen is broken up into 4 quadrants, 1 for each camera. And the infrared camera by itself pans. And I'm looking at the screen, you know, because you're watching it pan. And I said, hey, do you guys have that on a motor? That's pretty cool. And they said, no, it's just on a tripod. And we all look at each other like, wait a minute. And so everybody runs into the area where the infrared camera is. And we're trying to find, is it a slanted desk? Is there an open window with a breeze? Is there an air conditioning vent nearby? You know, did something fall? Nothing.
Any rational explanation?
No, exactly. No rational explanation why this camera slowly didn't like pan all of a sudden like something hit it. It slowly panned and there was no explanation for it. And believe me, everybody was there. And so we're like, wow. And then I'm about to leave again. We go back in, do some EVP stuff, electronic voice phenomenon. That's where you sit down, you ask questions, have a moment of silence. And then later you go back and review the tape or the digital recording. And sometimes you'll hear responses to those questions where nobody was speaking. And so they captured some EVP, I believe. Well, as I'm saying goodbye again in the Battery location of Violet Bank, it's like the last resort holdout of the location. It's a curved arc bricked interior in the center of the mansion, like a basement. And it's where the last resort place you go if you're under attack. And they stored equipment and ammo and food down there. Well, there's a camera there, and it looked like an upside down, gaseous, black, misty spider quickly crawling across the ceiling of that room. And again, nobody's in there. We're all outside. And we're all looking at each other like, did you just see that? And it happened like in a flicker of a second, like 2 or 3 seconds. This thing, like an upside down hand that's made of black mist, just crawls across the top of that arced brick battery. And so we run back in there and we do the more infrared stuff, electronic EVP stuff, EMF detectors. And I was like, after staying longer, it's like 3 a.m. something now. I'm like, hey guys, I've got plenty. I appreciate it. And I put it in the paper, and shared it with people. So again, nothing over the top, but enough to where it was substantial and very, very real.
I'm wondering what that phenomena could be. I mean, that's definitely nothing being regurgitated from the past, a black wispy spider type thing. That's not like an echo from a former time. That is something very much different.
It is. And, that's the thing. It's what I tell people when I talk to them at my lecture and when I'm discussing this with any groups or even individuals. I'll tell them my stance on this is I really have no idea what it is. And I can almost guarantee that most people out there have no idea or proof as to what this is. We can speculate and we can guesstimate, make educated speculation, but it's intriguing because there is something going on and we're seeing manifestations of whatever phenomena this is. And I don't think it's just one thing. I think there are many things going on and intersections of different things going on.
Yeah, I don't think anybody who's honest about this sort of stuff is going to tell you that they have any concrete answers unless they're trying to sell you something.
Yeah, that's right. And see, to me, one of the biggest indicators about what it might be or why it might be is the timing. It's like we really didn't find anything. And at the end of the night, 2:30 in the morning, whatever time it was, I said, "Hey guys, I'm getting a little tired. I got all the interviews. It's about time for me to hit the hay." And I'm saying goodbye, and we all had a good time. It's the timing of it. As I was leaving, that camera panned, and it was like, "Hey, just stay around a little longer. I'm enjoying this attention." And then we go back, investigate for another half hour, 40 minutes, and I'm about to leave again. And you have that upside down hand spider thing, flickering across like a black mist across the battery. And it's like it wanted me to stay, And I've had a few other things that it was about the timing of it. And I wish I had the exact date of that bicycle sighting and the TV sighting, because maybe there was a timing. Maybe they both happened on full moons, but I won't ever know because I didn't write down the exact time and date,
Right. Yeah, not many people keep a journal of these sorts of things, but that was your experiences accompanying a paranormal investigative group at, what was it called? Violet Hill?
Violet Bank. Mm-hmm.
Violet Bank, yeah. And you've done other sorts of things kind of like this, haven't you?
Yes. In fact, ever since then, that was Violet Bank was my first true paranormal investigation with the quote unquote professionals who have all the equipment. And then I met up with another paranormal group, RTL Paranormal, run by Ray Savino. They investigated the Beacon Theater in Hopewell, Virginia, and St. John's Episcopal Church in City Point, Hopewell, Virginia. And in fact, at that church, I actually interviewed her on my radio show too after the investigation. She would go there to practice her songs before the service on Sundays. So anywhere from Thursday, Friday, Saturday, she might go in there in the afternoon or in the evenings to, just make sure she's got everything down and the organ's working correctly. She was there by herself. And they have a swivel door that leads from one part of the church into the main worship hall where the organ is. And that swivel door, and I tested it. It's not like a breeze could open this. You have to push it. That door opened all by itself when she was there. And it's sort of scary because she's there, practicing, reading her music and, doing the chords and everything, the song. And the door opens and there's nobody there and it swivels and goes blip, 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 and stops. Then she hears footsteps, but there's nobody there. And the footsteps come towards her and just vanish. They stop. She doesn't hear them anymore. And then something highly unusual happens. And I don't hear this a lot. I haven't heard it a lot or seen it on shows or read about it. She had the intense smell of the fragrance of cucumbers. She told me, Chai, it's the strongest, intense cucumber smell I've ever had. And that was it. And it went away. And
that's incredibly interesting. I want to butt in here for just a moment because there are a lot of paranormal, ghostly type of entities that will bring along with them a very pungent smell of something. Sometimes it's perfume, sometimes it's cigars. This is the first time I've ever heard of cucumbers.
Yeah, me too. And she said it was the most intense, like almost overpowering. So Ray Savino brings in RTL Paranormal and they contact me. So I join the investigation and they bring a psychic. She's Native American. Her name was Wendy Traveler. And so there's a small cemetery on the grounds of St. John's Episcopal near City Point, Hopewell. And she's walking around and she stops. And she gets a sense of what she describes to us as a mischievous, happy 10-year-old, maybe give or take a year or two girl. And she's got a sense of that. And she says, that I don't know what that means, but I'm just picking that up. And the investigation continued. Little did we know, the church escort, the representative from the church who accompanied us, went back into the storage room. And that's where they kept the old ledgers, the original ledgers from like the 1800s, 1900s of people who died or were born, et cetera. And she goes through and about 20 minutes later, she comes out with the ledger and she goes, look, a little girl of such and such name. She was, about 10 or whatever years old, passed away and she was buried here. And it sort of independently confirmed what the psychic had sort of picked up on. So everybody thought, wow, this is really interesting. And I think after reviewing some of the digital recordings, they found some EVP stuff there too.
That's really incredible. Now, I've seen some things by RTL Paranormal on, I'm not sure if it was Amazon or just on TV, but I am a little bit familiar with them. It's really cool that you got to have such close proximity to one of their investigations.
Yes, and I've been on many of them too. In fact, when they investigated the Beacon Theater, this is really cool. I mean, this is fantastic. Somehow Ray had made connections through his extensive investigations, not just in this area, but around the East Coast and everything. He had made connections with Arts and Entertainment Network's Ghost Hunters. And he somehow got four of them, the four main characters, investigators, to come down and have an event at the Beacon Theater. So people signed up for the event, they paid whatever, and they went on investigations with the different investigators from Ghost Hunters on A&E. And of course, they told me about it. And I went there and I interviewed people who attended the event. They told of their encounters. And these are real people. They're not like seeking attention. They're not like, they don't have anything else going on. This is all they have. These are real people, and they seemed sincere. If they were lying to me, they had me fooled. But I interviewed them and on camera, and I played this, as you saw at my presentation at the American Legion Post 146. And I got to interview the ghost hunters, and I thought that was really fantastic because these people are going to actual allegedly haunted locations and investigating using the latest equipment and documenting everything on camera. And it was neat to talk to Rochelle and Brian, Mustafa, and what's the main guy? I forget his name. But it was really neat to meet them. And I got to tell you, this was another RTL investigation event at the Beacon without the ghost hunters. This is before. They went into a part of the Beacon Theater that used to be an office building where a doctor had performed abortions, and it's connected to the Beacon. And it wasn't originally, but then the Beacon Theater group or organization bought this connected adjacent building and incorporated it as like areas where the performers could have as their lounges and stuff that was away from the public. So in one of the rooms where he perform these abortions, it had been turned into like a VIP lounge. And so RTL had learned about this. So they brought in people who wanted to go in and sit down, and they turned off the lights, and they kept like a minimal light on for safety. And one of the ladies who was in there, she was like maybe in her 20s. She started squirming around in her seat. We could all feel it and sense it. She's a few seats over, and we could hear her, sort of squirming. And she cried out, screamed, and ran out of that room crying and refused to come back because she said something was like touching and tickling her physically.
Wow.
Yeah. So stuff. I was in the room when this happened. I just wasn't recording because it was a private kind of event,
Right. Well, that's incredible.
So yeah, while these things may not be over the top, and who can verify if she actually felt like something was touching her or she was putting on a show for everybody, I don't know. But to me, it's possible something was actually messing with her and scared her, and she ran out of the room crying.
Personally, I wouldn't suspect that somebody is going to make a show out of themselves during such an event. I mean, it's possible that someone would want the attention, but this is just a no-name person, right, from out of nowhere who was like, oh my gosh, something crazy is going on.
Exactly. And see, that's me. I'm a generally trusting kind of person. Until someone gives me a reason not to trust them, I generally give them some trust. I'm not saying I'd hand my kids over to them, but I'm a skeptical person. So I have to consider, especially being with my intelligence background, I'm not easily duped. I hope I'm not. Maybe I am and I just don't know it. But I like to think I'm not easily duped, and I'm skeptical. I'm level-minded. I believe in empirical evidence. I believe in objective science. So I'm not one of those people who are going to fit the facts to what I want my theory to be. I'm going to go and get the facts. I don't care where they lead me to. I want the truth about what's going on.
Well, there are people out there, Chai, who would consider that if you lend any credence to the things that we've been talking about today, then you are a particularly skeptical person. However, you and I both know better, don't we?
That's right. And to balance that, my skepticism, I, on the other hand, have an open mind. I'm not going to dismiss and ridicule without investigation. And that's where we were talking earlier previously about how these social media platforms like Facebook, YouTube, Google are trying to protect us for our own good against information that we may find they think is dangerous, but we may find interesting, but they don't want us to even be exposed to it for our own good. So that's where, to me, it's like, all right, look, I'm skeptical. I want to evaluate the information. I don't want you to decide that I don't need to hear it or see it,
Yeah. And I mean, dude, I was at your talk at the VFW post just this past week, and it kind of gave me a bit of a reality check. Like, a lot of those people there were just there for the free food, and when they saw the headline of the lecture, were like, well, this doesn't check out. Paranormal activity in the military, there's no such thing. But if you're interested in such a thing and you look into it, there are very, very, very many people who have given against all odds, against the profitability of their own career, have given their testimonies as to what has gone on in their own personal lives while they were in the military. And they've risked it all in order to tell people the truth.
Oh, exactly. And anyone can go out there and go to YouTube or rumble.com. That's far less censored. If you look up UFOs and nukes, Michael Hastings has done some presentations, and he's written a book, UFOs and Nukes, I believe, where he documents these officers and military professionals coming forward and testifying about what's happened. These are official accounts where every single nuke base we've had has been visited by unidentified flying objects that have manipulated those nukes. They've either shut them down or started the countdown to launch, only to end it at the last second. So stuff is happening. These are people who have retirement pensions. And so they have a lot to lose too, but they're coming forward, like you said. And that's called UFOs and Nukes. Just go and try to find it. You can do some quick searching on rumble.com. You might find something on YouTube, because they tend not to delete too many UFO channels these days, because the government finally came out and said in 2017, hey, it's real, and we want to hear more. So check that out. And that's something, like you said, it's starting to come out more, because the government's finally given the blessing to say you can talk about it without losing your clearance or your job, or your pension.
I'm glad you mentioned it because there really is a bunch of bombshell stories, especially around the time of the Red Scare, where there were different nuclear facilities where these things would come visit and basically shut down all operation. Multiple stories of this kind of thing. It was just like a phenomenon for a while.
Yeah, these things tend to happen in what they call flaps, a UFO flap, where
Yes.
for a season or a year or two, you had a lot of sightings, and then it sort of dies down for a little bit and comes back. And the thing is, most people, up until the last few years and before the government said, hey, they're real, this is when the government ridiculed people and said, you're on drugs, there's something wrong with you, were you drinking? Most people wouldn't come forward. But when you start looking into this legitimately, and you have different sources and all that, and you start reading about the history, and you're getting official documents as well, and reading books that other people have written that are highly sourced, you come across things, and I'll keep this brief, like Admiral Byrd back in
Oh goodness,
1947.
we're getting into Byrd.
Yes, he takes a U.S. naval task force to Antarctica. It's Operation High Jump. He has an aircraft carrier. He's got like 2,300 Marines. He's got,
I think it was more like 4,500.
was it? Yeah, it's some kind of big number. But he's got an entire task force with submarines, support ships, destroyers, freighters, supply ships.
Yeah, and this was called a scientific expedition.
Exactly. And they were also trying to prep for like cold temperature training as well, and to navigate Antarctica. I believe it was supposed to be a 6-month-long operation, or give or take. And so they go down to Antarctica, this entire battle force. After a few weeks, like maybe 6 weeks, they turn tail and come back. And in a Chilean newspaper, Admiral Byrd is quoted as saying, we have to be prepared as a country to face an opponent that can travel from pole to pole very quickly at high speeds. And everyone's like, what is he talking about? Then in a few years later, I don't know if it was the late 40s or the early to mid 50s, he goes on a program on CBS called the Longines Chronogram or something like that. It's a weird name, but it's like a news interview show, and it's Admiral Byrd. You can find this on YouTube right now. They think this is so outlandish and so obscure, no one's going to look it up, or they can say whatever. But he's on this interview show where these two guys are interviewing Admiral Byrd. He's from Virginia, by the way. And they're talking to him, and Admiral Byrd on camera says, there is land that has never been seen by human eyes beyond the South Pole at Antarctica. So land beyond the South Pole, the size of the United States, that has never been seen, that is rich in minerals such as coal and uranium. He says in this interview, and you can watch it, anybody, that there's enough coal to power the world for the next like 100 or 200 years, I believe. I might be give or take, on that one. But if you watch this interview, he says some things that don't exactly make sense. First, there are riches down there like uranium and coal that could easily solve energy problems around this world. Yet the Antarctica Treaty, which was signed by many, many nations, more than any other treaty in existence, and longer for any other treaty in existence, even to this day is still in effect, says we're going to keep Antarctica off limits and pure. Yeah, you can take a cruise, but that's not going to take you to the interior, and you can only go into the interior of Antarctica if you're part of a military or militarily approved governmental scientific expedition. But that treaty is still in effect. That's one. Two, if there was enough coal to power the world for the next 100 or 200 years, according to Byrd, why wouldn't we be exploiting that? Three, how can you have an area of land never seen by human eyes the size of the United States beyond the South Pole? Because once you go into a forest halfway, you're going out of a forest, right? That's that classic like joke quiz, mind tingler. Like, how far can you go into a forest? And the answer is halfway, because once you're halfway into a forest, you're going out of the forest. The same is true with Antarctica, according to what we've been told. How can you have land beyond the South Pole that's never been seen by human eyes the size of North America? Because on the other side of the South Pole, that's on the other side. It's not something that couldn't or shouldn't have been seen before. But you can actually watch this on YouTube. So it's very interesting.
According to what is available to the public eye, apparently Operation High Jump was an expedition where we got toothpaste.
What? I hadn't heard that one.
Yeah, toothpaste was developed during Operation High Jump, which, that was the late 40s, early 50s, somewhere around there. And apparently that's all we got out of it. However, I think there is much more beneath the surface. If you're sending U.S. troops into Antarctica, there's probably something else going on.
Yeah, and again, how I talked about timing earlier, the timing of certain things can give you a clue that more is going on than what we're being told, because it was supposed to have been half a year, and it ended up being a month and a half when they came back, almost with their tails between their legs. And I won't even go into what some people claim have happened. They encountered Nazis that had bases in the ice. Because the Nazis,
there are a lot of stories about confrontations with the Nazi forces after they had already been defeated and things like that. And there is literally no substantial ground to stand on when talking about that. So we can't really dive into that with any sort of certainty.
Exactly. And what we do know is the Nazis actually had expeditions, or at least one expedition to Antarctica, where they sent teams out to investigate it and explore it before World War II. And they claimed it as their own land called New Schwabenland or something like that.
New Schwabenland, yeah. And it was a big thing with the Vril Society, apparently. But once again, there's not that much documentation in reality in regards to this settling Antarctica.
Oh, yeah. And here's something interesting. About 10 years ago, have you heard of Lake Vostok?
I have not.
Vostok. Yeah, this is interesting. Just the lake itself is interesting. It's a subglacial lake. What that means is it is a liquid lake that is beneath a glacier, about 2 or 3 miles beneath glacial ice.
Wow.
And there is a pocket of air, and there is liquid water, and it's heated. It's not frozen because there are natural heated vents from beneath that keep the water, liquid. And there's a magnetic anomaly, very large, the size of a small city, some say, or like bigger than a carrier, beneath the ice. And so the Russians had a scientific camp above Lake Vostok, this subglacial lake in Antarctica. And they drilled through the miles of ice to get to the air pocket of the lake. And people are saying, wait a minute, before you break through into that air pocket to get samples, you may want to consider that there might be things and microbes and organisms that might be dangerous because they haven't been seen in the world in however millions or billions of years. But the Russians said, we're going to do it anyway. So, and you can look up, there used to be an article, I haven't looked it up in years, but Raiders of the Lost Lake, I believe is what it's called. But look up Lake Vostok. So the Russians proceed to drill into this air pocket to get water samples and whatever. And then I remember I was keeping up with this because at the time, this is when I was at the Joint Intelligence Operations Center at Central Command Headquarters, right? So I had whenever I had downtime, I'd look up these stories and conspiracy theories, but I was reading about this, and the Russians drilled through into the air pocket. And then the next stories that I got for the next month, Russians lose contact with Lake Vostok camp. So they go offline for a month or 2 or 3. And then finally, when contact is restored, this makes me think of The Thing, right? The 1980s movie.
Oh, yeah. Kurt Russell.
Yeah. Great soundtrack by Ennio Morricone. But it makes me think of that. And after a few weeks of being out of contact, suddenly they said, yep, everything's fine. The scientists are fine. Nothing to see here. You don't hear anything else about it.
Weird.
But they had a magnetic anomaly, something that was metallic underneath that lake or somewhere underneath the ice next to the lake or in the lake And the Russians drilled through. They lost contact for a month, maybe, or a few weeks. And then they said, hey, everything's fine. We just had a communications problem. That's it. But I haven't looked into it for a while. I'm going to have to look into it after this. But I find that very intriguing.
Yeah, it really is. And there are so many stories like this. You could go down that dang rabbit hole, especially when it comes to the military, especially when it comes to mid-century. I mean, we're talking about 50 years ago. There's so many weird things. Like right after World War II, there's just a plethora of weird rabbit holes you can go down. And I encourage everyone who's listening, just go down them. Like it's a lot of fun. There's not necessarily going to be anything that come out of it substantial. However, you might learn something.
Oh, yeah. And one last thing briefly about timing. 1947, July, Roswell incident. Allegedly one or maybe two unidentified flying objects crash, flying saucers crash into the desert near Roswell, New Mexico, where at the time that was our only nuclear strategic bombing squadron. These UFOs crash, they're recovered, alien bodies. We have witnesses who have come forward and who said they were threatened, so they had to remain silent. But the next day, or the next release of the newspaper, it's headlines. Flying saucer recovered, or something to this. I'm paraphrasing, and I might have the phrasing wrong, but it says flying saucer, United States Air Force recovers crashed UFO, or something like that. The next day, it's retracted, and it's like, nope, it was a weather balloon. Okay, so that's July 1947. So a month or two later, September 1947, timing. The Air Force wasn't always the Air Force. It started out as the Army Air Force or the Army Air Corps. The Air Force was a subsequent branch of the Army. Well, in September of 1947, a couple of months after Roswell, the Air Force becomes its own service. Okay, that could be coincidence. Maybe it was just time. Well, a month or so after that, the National Security Act establishes the Central Intelligence Agency. That's when our national security state officially begins, with the birth of the CIA. So you have a downed, unidentified aircraft or two, UFOs. A month or two later, the Air Force becomes its own service. A month or two later, the CIA is formed. And it's like, wait a minute, is something going on that we don't know about here? So something to look into.
Absolutely. And out of the Air Force, we also got Project Blue Book, which is another whole rabbit hole to go down.
Yes. Oh, yeah. Project Signal, Project Grudge, which were UFO
Grudge,
related.
Sign, all of those.
And then, of course, the last one was Blue Book, like you said, which was it was actually, according to everything that I heard, and Dr. J. Allen Hynek himself, who was in charge of it, he was debunking all these things until it got so ridiculous. Everybody was thinking, look, come on, guys, swamp gas, reflected light from the feathers, the down feathers of ducks flying over DC. You know, it's like after a while it got ludicrous. Hynek leaves Blue Book and starts arguing for the other side, saying, hey, we were debunking. That's all we were doing.
Yeah, he was getting paid to make molehills out of mountains, basically. And after he got done with that side of his career, he was like, hey, guys, listen. This is the truth of the fact. And literally came out just like, yeah, UFOs are a thing. We don't know what they are. And, my entire career up to this point has been propaganda.
Exactly. And that's the thing. A lot of people, and it's not their fault, because there's been a government conditioning process since the 40s to convince people of a certain narrative. And so whenever somebody would mention UFOs or anything that didn't fit into the mainstream narrative of the existence of our reality, they encouraged ridicule, disbelief, and outright like anger about things. So it's not their fault. When they hear UFO, they think, oh, alien aircraft. No, all UFO means is whatever you saw was unidentified. And you saw
right, something you can't place into a specific box.
Yes, but most people, not to their blame, have been made to think that means when you and I talk about UFO to someone who doesn't know better, they're thinking in their minds, alien spacecraft. But
Yeah, they're thinking of something that flies that's not from this earth.
exactly. And we've also been conditioned through Hollywood and everything else and other mainstream media sources of all kinds, even in the scientific world. We've all been conditioned to think that if there were UFOs, they're coming from Mars and Jupiter or another galaxy or whatever. And
Now, don't forget Venus.
Venus too. But lately, some other theories have come out. Like, it's not necessarily from other planets, as we've been told, but it could be from other dimensions. And that's becoming more popular these days because the word about it is getting out.
Right, and that's sort of the Jacques Vallée theory, is that we're not living in a Flash Gordon sort of reality. It's more something coming from the other side.
Yes. In fact, I haven't read it all, but I've got a copy of, actually, I've got the recently re-released edition and the original edition. It was hard to find. Jacques Vallée's book called Passport to Magonia.
Okay.
Have you heard of that one?
I have not.
Magonia is apparently this fictional land. But he wrote a book called Passport to Magonia that catalogs UFO sightings from ancient times to his then modern times. I don't know the exact release date, but it was in the 70s maybe. But he talks about a lot of things. There's another book he has that he released concerning sightings called Wheels in the Sky. That'll be easier to find. But Passport to Magonia should be pretty easy to find because it was re-released about 5 to 7 years ago. But anyway, he talks about a lot of different accounts from history where they found documents to back it up of UFO sightings and strange things. One was about an infantry unit of, it was either British or Indian military. I think they were allied at some point. This company, maybe 100 men, were walking up this mountainous trail, and there was a low-level cloud fog that had descended down onto the trail where they were walking. Well, the entire company walks along the trail and vanishes into the fog. The cloud lifts up, and no one ever saw anyone from that company again. So yeah, really. And Jacques Vallée, he talks about non-conventional UFO stuff where it's like there's more psychology involved in it than nuts and bolts spacecraft from Venus, coming to visit us.
Right, and Jacques Vallée is a very interesting character, especially if you look into his quote-unquote theory of everything, where he's really like kind of linking the UFO experiences that we have, or the sightings that we have, with more terrestrial paranormal experiences as well, and saying that they could be very much from the same source.
Oh yeah. And that's the thing. Here's another account that someone shared with me that fits into what you just said. At Special Operations Command, I became friends with a naval lieutenant commander, and he was a JAG officer, Judge Advocate General. But earlier in his career, he, was just a naval officer, and he was standing watch on his ship. It was during the daytime, and he said he saw like maybe a 200 to 300 yard glowing circle of water. And I thought it was at nighttime because he said it was glowing, and how could you see it during the day? But he said it was so bright that during the day you could see this 200 to 300 diameter of glowing water, 200 to 300 feet or yards glowing diameter of water from the ship. And he told his captain, he put it in a log, told his captain about it, and the captain said, well, let's strike this from the log and pretend it never happened and never speak about it again. So the terrestrial sources of these things is very possible because a lot of people see what are called USOs, unidentified submerged objects. And that's what this was. And I know someone who directly saw it. And he has no reason to try to impress me, nothing to gain by lying to me. But the thing is, the sources of these things that we see could be from within this world, under the water, or from other dimensions. We just don't know. But it's strange to me. It's that the official narrative is trying to tell us these are objects flying in from other planets in our solar system or interstellar space, or whatever.
Yeah, and that's incredibly short-sighted as far as our current understanding of what they could be. I mean, there are a lot of theories, sure, saying that they're from off-world sources, and there are a lot of theories saying that they are also possibly from here or that they're from an adjacent time and space. And we don't really know. Their capabilities are, first of all, just far outclass anything that we have any understanding of.
Oh, exactly. And there's another book. This guy, I wish I had all this at the top of my head, but this guy is an investigator from Westmoreland County in Pennsylvania, I believe. And for about 3 years in the early to mid 70s, there was a flap of UFO sightings in Westmoreland County. The book is called Silent Invasion. And
I've heard of it.
Yeah, I forget his name. Really good book. I've read it. And he's been a guest on Coast to Coast AM. But Stan Gordon, maybe?
Yeah, he's the guy who did Invasion on Chestnut Ridge with Small Town Monsters.
Yes, I saw that. Loved it. Well,
great film.
During this flap, people were seeing orbs and UFOs and flying saucers, but they were also seeing, this ties to sort of everything together we were talking about over the last couple hours. They were seeing Bigfoot sightings with the UFOs.
They were correlative.
Yes. One encounter had these orb UFOs landed in this farmer's field glowing softly in the background.
I know exactly what you're talking about. It's a good story.
These Bigfoot creatures are crawling along walking along the fence, long arms, glowing eyes, and they're making baby crying sounds coming away from these glowing orbs. It's just crazy.
Yeah, and they got shot at.
Didn't they disappear when they were shot?
I don't recall the exact circumstances. I think they retreated to the craft and took off.
Yeah, it's amazing how, before Skinwalker Ranch sort of combined poltergeist activity, cryptozoological sightings, and UFOs together, because all that was going on at Skinwalker Ranch in Hunt for the Skinwalker, that book. But before that book, and that was seen as like a pariah, like, how dare you combine these worlds? Before that, Bigfoot researchers said, hey, you UFO guys stay over there. And UFO people were like, you Bigfoot people stay over there. And the ghost hunting people were like, oh, we're not part of any of that. They all combined with Skinwalker Ranch. And now it seems like there might be crossovers and overlapping and intersections of different phenomenon, and who knows what all this is.
Yeah, and if you go back, there are encounters with these things, and the correlations between, say, cryptid activity and poltergeist activity is kind of uncanny. It just seems to come up again and again, but it wasn't ever something that people drew correlations with until recently.
Oh, exactly. Back in the Middle Ages, fairy circles might have been UFOs, and fairies might have been modern day aliens like the Greys. It's just a different nomenclature based on our modern expectations. And that's where Jacques Vallée comes into play too with that. So it's really intriguing how all this mixes and matches and connects. It's like one of those situations where you start putting thumbtacks on a board connected with thread with headlines, and you're like, yeah, wait a minute,
Yeah, absolutely. But we're about to hit our time for tonight. So, Chai, I wanted to get into your podcast that you actually host yourself, because I love listening to your show. It fits right in with a lot of shows that I already listen to. And once I met you, I started listening to this and was like, this guy is he's literally just like a man after my own heart. You cover on your podcast, which is called Freedom Cognition, I would say current events and politics. Is that correct?
Yeah, it's current events, and there is some politics because you have to use the labels that people are using so people know what you're talking about. But I try to keep it. I do my best to keep it nonpartisan. In other words, if there are good people on both sides of the aisle, bad people on both sides of the aisle, along with good ideas and bad ideas all over the place, I'm going to call out what I think is bad, or at least questionable, regardless of the label. But I do try to talk about, and thanks for bringing that up, by the way. I try to share the truth out there with people based on my intel background and experience and intuition about psychological operations that people might have experienced over the last 3.5 years. And I try to keep it as objective as I can based on facts and source materials. even though, just like when we're talking about Bigfoot, UFOs, and altered history, people might think, "Wait a minute, this guy's crazy." But if you listen to it, it's like I'm basing it on facts and um, assessments based on my own background and experience. So thanks for bringing that up. It is about current events, and I try to make it more fun, like what we're talking about here tonight. So it's been a real pleasure. Every now and then and I'm going to make it more often. I talk about paranormal stuff like we're talking about here, and I have guests on who I'll interview them and consider their point of view and go over what they have to say. Um, and I'll just try to make it as interesting and entertaining as possible too. So, and the information that I share could keep you healthy. So,
Well, I'm definitely happy to bring it up because for me, this is a independent person talking about current events in a way that most news networks are not going to cover it in such a way. There is a paid narrative usually going on in news networks. You're not that.
it's like something that I knew for a long time, ever since I went into Intel. But the more I learned over time, I realized how extensive it was, but it was growing as well. You know, the mainstream media in this country and probably the world, but definitely in this country, 98%, and I'm being generous, it could be more, but 98% of the mainstream media in the United States is controlled by five, possibly six, but at least five individuals who own the corporations, that own the companies, that own the sub companies, et cetera, that own our mainstream media. Five people. And just like I say sometimes during the intro of my show, it's apparent who they like, who they don't like, and what kind of world they want for us. A place filled with uncertainty, fear, panic, and chaos.
Yeah, and when I was probably around 18 or 19 years old, I wasn't at all interested in mainstream news. I would hang out with my dad while he would watch the news, and he was very much into it. And it was all very boring to me. It was packaged garbage as far as I was concerned, and it was boring. And then somewhere around that time, I found that there were other people on the internet who were sharing perspectives that were very much different, things that you wouldn't hear on the news stations. And then going back into the car with my dad, like the stations he would listen to would poo-poo those people. They'd say, "Oh, this is just a bunch of erroneous BS," and don't give it any credence. But I would listen to their arguments, and I'd listen to the arguments of the people who I had found online, and found that the people who were on the news networks were very much lacking in any sort of basis on their arguments, as opposed to the people who were just independent news reporters online. And I found that there was a lot more to what was going on in the world stage, I guess you could say, that we weren't being told generally. And this is something that I find on your show, is that there's something going on that we're not generally being told, that you actually you're privy to in a certain sense. You have some sort of access to this stuff because recently you reported on a local sheriff community, I believe.
Yes, it was a National Sheriff's Association for rural and like small town areas. And it happened right here in Petersburg, Virginia, at their library, which is like a small convention center that I discovered to my surprise. And they invited sheriffs and police officers and law enforcement from across the country because this is a national organization. And it's so large of an organization that it got the notice of the director of Homeland Security, Mayorkas. And so they invited him to be the keynote speaker, along with like a host, like maybe 12 to 15 other high profile people in the current presidential administration and agencies like the FBI, et cetera, et cetera. But I cover the Mayorkas speech. And this guy, he's the one who's allowed our border to be open. And I'm not being political here. This is not partisan. This is fact. Over the last 2.5 years or so under the Biden administration, we have let in millions of undocumented illegal entries into our country.
It's unprecedented.
Unprecedented. some estimates say that there are 40,000 Chinese nationals in our country, along with terrorists from all over the world. So anyway, Mayorkas is the guy who's behind this, and he's talking about how they're trying to fight fentanyl distribution, leading to the overdose of over 100,000 Americans over the last year, and we're trying to stop this. All he has to do is shut down the border so the illegals can't enter, and you've got 90% or more of the problem fixed. But anyway, again, it's not political. It's fact. People can speculate at how effective a wall would be, but we know objectively 100% how ineffective not having a wall is. Like,
Exactly.
unprecedented. And we're losing people to fentanyl and other drugs in our country like never before. But now, Mayorkas was speaking to all these law enforcement agencies about this, and he was asked a few questions, but they were softball. He was allowed not to answer. But yeah, so I covered events like that, and I try to talk about these things that you won't get anywhere else. And I got to tell you this, and thanks for bringing it up, that Mayorkas speech was not covered anywhere in mainstream media. In fact, I was the only media at that speech, and I don't think he expected me or they expected me there, because I was invited to come because we have a great relationship with our local sheriff of Petersburg, and I've interviewed her on my radio show, and we've interviewed her at lnnusa.com, and so she told us about it, and that's why I went. But I happened to forget my press pass that day, the thing that hangs around your neck saying you're with the press, but I signed in, got in, no problem. And it wasn't obvious that I was press, so maybe things were said there that would not have been said if they had known press was there. But I recorded it on video, the entire speech, and I reported it on my show as an exclusive. So,
Hey everybody, this is Editing Mode Alex. I'm not sure what happened, but I lost about the last minute and a half of my side of the audio for this interview. So around this point, we were about to close out, and I probably would have said something like, check out Chai's Freedom Cognition podcast, currently available on podbean.com or the Podbean podcast app on your phone. And Chai, I want to thank you for coming out. It was a pleasure hearing your stories.
hey, thank you, Alex, and I'm going to stay odd.
All right, guys, thank you for joining us for our first ever members-only Round 2 episode with Chai Gallahun. I had to put this one together in kind of a hurry, so they can only get better from here. Chai mentioned an interview with Admiral Byrd. I'm going to go ahead and put that in the show notes. It is pretty interesting to listen to, 15-minute interview back on old black and white television. Pretty interesting. And also, I'm going to put a link to Chai's Freedom Cognition podcast down in the show notes for this episode as well. So thank you guys all for joining our first ever Round 2. We'll see you later.